The story of Rome's founding is a tale of brother against brother. We all know the legend of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf. But what if the peaceful story hides a much darker truth? This investigation will reveal the shocking historical realities buried beneath the myth. We will trace the legend from its divine beginnings to the bloody moment Rome was born, examining ancient contradictions and modern archaeology. You will discover how a single myth was used to justify power, explain social divisions, and forge an empire's identity. Was the she-wolf a protective animal or something else entirely? And why would a civilization build its origin on an act of murder? The answers lie in a blend of folklore, politics, and hard evidence. What does it truly mean when a nation's founding story is built on violence? Our story begins not with a wolf but with a king driven by fear. In the ancient city of Alba Longa, a ruler named Amulius had seized the throne from his own brother, Numitor. To secure his stolen power, Amulius made a calculated move. He forced his niece, Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to 30 years of celibacy. This was not an act of piety but a political strategy. By condemning her to a life without children, he believed he had permanently erased the legitimate royal bloodline, removing any future threat to his rule. But the gods, as myths so often tell us, have a way of upending the plans of men. The legend says that the god Mars, deity of war, found Silvia and fathered twin sons by her. This divine conception was a catastrophe for Amulius. A Vestal virgin breaking her vow was punishable by death, but the father being a god complicated matters immensely. More importantly, it meant the royal blood he tried to extinguish had not only returned but was now blessed with divine ancestry. These twins, Romulus and Remus, were born as living symbols of a legitimacy far greater than any king could claim. Amulius reacted with the panic of a tyrant. He ordered the infant twins to be taken from their mother and drowned in the flooding waters of the Tiber River. This act was meant to be discreet, a quiet disappearance into the muddy current that would erase his problem forever. He imprisoned Silvia, sealing her fate as well. It was a brutal, final solution, an attempt to wash away the future challenge to his throne. In that moment, the twins were just two more victims in a long history of political murders, their story seemingly destined to end before it began, lost to the river and forgotten. Yet, as the basket carrying them was cast into the waters, the legend pivots from a tale of human cruelty to one of miraculous survival. The river itself, it is said, refused the king's command, setting in motion the events that would lead to the wolf, the shepherd, and the founding of an empire. The king's command should have been their end. Cast into the swollen, muddy currents of the Tiber River, the twin infants in their small basket were at the mercy of the flood. The waters were high and fast, a churning brown torrent that would have dashed any ordinary craft to pieces. Yet the legend tells us the river itself took pity. Ancient sources whisper of divine hands at work, suggesting the river god Tiberinus intervened, calming the treacherous currents just enough to guide the fragile vessel. This was no random drift, it was a directed journey, a supernatural delivery system ensuring the children of a god did not perish by mere mortal decree. Their basket did not sink, it floated, carried not toward oblivion but toward a very specific destiny. After navigating the dangerous waters, the basket finally came to rest, catching securely in the tangled, submerged roots of a wild fig tree at the base of a hill called the Palatine. This was not just any location. This muddy bank, this specific cluster of roots, would become one of the most sacred sites in all of Roman memory. It was later known as the Lupercal, a cave-like grotto sanctified as the very spot where the city's founders were saved. In that moment, the river did not just spare two babies, it delivered them to the exact ground upon which their future and the future of an empire would be built. There in the quiet mud by the riverbank, their cries did not go unheard. A she-wolf, fresh from drinking, discovered the abandoned twins. According to the ancient historian Livy, she was drawn by their helpless whimpering, and in a moment that defies nature, she lowered her muzzle to them. Instead of attacking, she licked them clean and offered her milk. This image, the wolf nurturing human infants, is the very heart of the legend, immortalized in bronze and stone for centuries. But this moment is far more complex than a simple animal rescue. To understand it, we must listen to the Latin word itself, luper. This word holds a deliberate, provocative double meaning. It can indeed mean a she-wolf, the fierce animal of the wild. But in the rough slang of ancient Rome, luper was also a common term for a prostitute. This linguistic ambiguity opens a door to a very different, more human interpretation. Perhaps the twins were not saved by a wild beast at all, but by a woman of the outskirts, a shepherd's wife perhaps, whose social standing was so low she was branded with the name of an animal. This alternative reading suggests the Romans themselves may have been whispering a more earthy, less magical origin for their founders, one where their first nourishment came not from the wild, but from the very margins of their own society. Yet the wolf as an animal symbol is profoundly intentional. The wolf was the sacred animal of Mars, their divine father. Its appearance was a sign of his protection, a direct link to the war god's favor. Furthermore, the wolf represented the untamed wilderness that surrounded the 7 hills of Rome, a force of raw, potent, and dangerous power. By having the wolf nurture the twins, the myth declares that Rome's founders were literally fed by the wild, imbued with its strength and ferocity from their first moments. Their survival was a collaborative miracle of the natural world. The she-wolf was not alone. A woodpecker, another bird sacred to Mars, is said to have flown to the infants, bringing them scraps of food in its beak. So here is the complete picture, a tableau of divine intervention. The twins are suckled by the wolf of Mars and fed by the bird of Mars. This is not random charity, it is a coordinated campaign of preservation by their father's domain. The motif is clear. The children are marked by the divine, protected by the very essence of war and wilderness. This blending of the civilized and the wild is the core paradox of Rome's origin story. The future builders of the world's greatest city, the creators of law, aqueducts, and armies, begin their lives not in a palace but in the dirt, nourished by creatures of the forest. It suggests that Roman identity was forged in this contradiction, claiming both the raw power of nature and the ordered ambition of civilization as their birthright. What does it mean for a people to believe their founders were raised by beasts? This miraculous tableau did not remain a secret for long. The cries of the infants and the presence of the unusual animals attracted the attention of a man who worked these very slopes. His name was Faustulus, the chief shepherd for King Amulius, the very king who had ordered the twins' death. Imagine the scene from his perspective. A man of the land, he would have known the behavior of every creature on Palatine Hill. To see a she-wolf, an animal synonymous with danger to his flock, tenderly nursing 2 human babies would have been a sight that defied all logic and experience. In that moment, Faustulus faced a choice. He could report this strange discovery to his master, the king, and likely earn a reward for revealing the survival of the condemned children. Or he could follow a deeper instinct, perhaps one of compassion, or perhaps one that recognized the hand of the divine in this impossible event. He chose the latter. Faustulus carefully took the twins from the wolf's den and carried them home to his wife, Acalarentia. Here, the legend takes another fascinating turn toward the human and the humble. Faustulus and Acalarentia became the twins' foster parents, raising them as their own sons in a simple shepherd's hut on the Palatine. This pastoral upbringing is not just a charming detail, it is a crucial piece of their character formation. Growing up as shepherds, Romulus and Remus learned the skills of survival, leadership, and conflict resolution in the most direct way possible. They commanded flocks, defended territory from wild animals and rival herdsmen, and navigated the harsh realities of life on the frontier. This experience forged them into natural leaders, strong, resourceful, and accustomed to command. The local youths, other shepherds and herdsmen, naturally gravitated toward their strength and charisma, forming the nucleus of what would become Rome's first citizen army. But the figure of a Calarentia adds another layer of profound mystery to this domestic scene. Her own mythology is complex and shadowy. In some ancient traditions, she was not just a shepherd's wife, but was herself identified as the Luper who saved the twins. This interpretation leans into that double meaning of the word. If Luper could mean a woman of the outskirts, then a Calarentia, by nursing the infants, literally became their she-wolf. Later Roman tradition even honored her with a festival called the Larentalia, suggesting she was a figure of significant, if ambiguous, importance. So within the walls of that simple hut, the myth seems to compress two realities. The boys are raised by a loving foster mother, giving them a human anchor and a moral grounding. Yet, swirling around her is the persistent echo of that wild, animalistic origin, as if their connection to the raw power of the wolf was maintained through her care. Their childhood was a blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary, of learning to tend sheep while being subconsciously prepared to found a city. This dual identity, as both sons of the soil and children of a god, would define everything that came next, setting the stage for a discovery that would shatter their peaceful pastoral life and ignite the final, fatal conflict between the brothers. This life on the frontier was not one of quiet herding. As Romulus and Remus grew into young men, their strength and boldness became legendary among the local shepherds. They were natural leaders, charismatic and unafraid, attracting a loyal following of other young men from the hills. This band was not a peaceful agricultural collective. They were a company of adventurers living by their wits and their strength on the margins of society. Their days were filled with the rough work of defending their flocks from wolves and thieves, but their ambitions soon grew beyond simple defense. They began to lead raids, targeting the rich herds that grazed on the neighboring plains. This was a life of banditry, a deliberate choice to live outside the established order, taking what they needed and enforcing their own rough code of honor among the 7 hills. In many ways, this period was their true education. They learned strategy by planning raids, leadership by commanding their band, and justice by settling disputes within their group. They were crafting the very skills required to build and rule a city, but they were doing it from outside the walls of any civilization. Their authority came not from royal blood, which they still did not know they possessed, but from proven courage and the loyalty they inspired. This existence, however, could not remain isolated forever. Their territory bordered the lands of a much more powerful neighbor, the very city from which they had been cast out as infants, Alba Longa. Unknowingly, their most frequent raids targeted the herds of their own grandfather, the deposed King Numitor, who still lived on his estates near the city. The conflict was inevitable. Numitor's herdsmen, tired of losing their best cattle and sheep to these bold hill bandits, finally set a trap. During one particularly daring raid, Remus was captured. He was dragged before the local authorities and then presented to King Numitor himself for judgment. The old king, living in the shadow of his usurper brother Amulius, saw in this captured young bandit not just a thief, but a striking and noble bearing that seemed strangely familiar. Meanwhile, back on the Palatine, Romulus discovered his brother was missing. He immediately began to plan a rescue, mobilizing his entire band of shepherds. But the confrontation brewing in Alba Longa would not be solved by force of arms alone. As Numitor questioned the defiant young prisoner, a far greater revelation was about to unfold, one that would transform these outlaw leaders into princes and set the final, tragic stage for the founding of a city. The raid that changed everything was not their first, but it was their most ambitious. Romulus and Remus, leading their band of shepherds, targeted a particularly fine herd grazing in the lush fields near Alba Longa. These were no ordinary cattle. They were the prized possessions of the deposed king, Numitor, though the twins had no idea of his identity or their connection to him. The plan was simple: a swift strike under cover of dusk, scattering the herdsmen and driving the animals back toward the safety of the hills. But something went wrong. Perhaps Remus, always the more impulsive of the two, pushed too far into guarded territory, or perhaps the herdsmen, tired of these relentless thefts, were finally prepared. In the confusion of the stampeding cattle, Remus became separated from his brother and the main group. He was surrounded, overwhelmed, and dragged away in bonds, a captured bandit facing the harsh justice of the city. He was taken directly to Alba Longa and presented before the old king himself. Numitor, living a life of quiet exile under his brother Amulius's watchful eye, saw another troublesome shepherd from the hills. But as he looked closer, he was struck. This young man, bound and dusty from the struggle, did not cower. He stood with a defiant pride, his eyes holding a fire that seemed out of place for a common thief. There was a nobility in his bearing, an echo of a lineage Numitor thought lost forever. The king's curiosity overcame his anger. Instead of ordering immediate execution, he began to question the prisoner, asking not just about the raid but about his origins. Who were his parents? Where did he come from? Remus, with nothing to lose, told the story he knew of being a shepherd's son raised by Faustulus on the Palatine. Each answer deepened the mystery for Numitor, stirring old memories and long-buried hopes. Back on the Palatine, a different kind of storm was brewing. Romulus had returned with the cattle, but without his brother. The news of Remus's capture spread panic through their band. For Faustulus, the old shepherd, this was the moment he had dreaded for years. Seeing Romulus's fury and determination to mount a reckless rescue, Faustulus knew the time for secrets had passed. He took Romulus aside, away from the others, and presented him with an object kept hidden for decades, the proof he had safeguarded since that day by the river. It was the very basket, now fragile and worn, in which the infant twins had been placed in the Tiber. He told Romulus everything: the story of their mother, Silvia, their divine father Mars, the cruel order of King Amulius, and their miraculous salvation by the she-wolf. "You are not my son," he explained. "You are the grandson of King Numitor, the rightful heirs to the throne of Alba Longa." In that moment, Romulus's entire world transformed. He was no longer just a shepherd leader, a bandit of the hills. He was a prince wrongfully condemned, his brother now a prisoner in the court of the usurper who sought their deaths. The personal injury of his brother's capture exploded into a righteous cause. This was no longer about a rescue, it was about reclamation and revenge. Armed with this explosive truth, Romulus did not simply gather his shepherds for a fight, he mobilized them for a revolution. He laid out the entire story, revealing their royal blood and the injustice done to their family. The band of outlaws became an army of liberation, united by a newfound purpose that was far greater than cattle raids. They marched not as thieves toward Alba Longa, but as princes returning to claim their birthright, setting in motion a confrontation that would topple a king, and in doing so, unleash the ambitions that would ultimately pit brother against brother. The march from the Palatine Hills to the walls of Alba Longa was no longer a raiding party, it was a procession of vengeance. Romulus, now fully aware of his royal blood, led his band of hardened shepherds not as outlaws but as a rightful army. Their fury was cold and focused, transformed by the revelation of their stolen birthright. Meanwhile, within the city, a parallel drama was unfolding. King Numitor, having heard Remus' story and seen the undeniable resemblance to his lost daughter, had already pieced together the truth. He recognized his grandson. Instead of a prisoner, Remus became a conspirator, plotting with the old king from inside the very palace that had condemned him. This created a perfect pincer movement. Romulus and his force provided the external threat, a distraction at the gates, while Numitor and Remus mobilized the king's own discontented supporters within. The people of Alba Longa had long lived under Amulius' fear, and the sudden appearance of the legitimate heirs, sons of the god Mars no less, shattered the usurper's authority. The attack was swift and decisive. There was no prolonged siege. The palace guards, confronted with the righteous anger of the twins and the defection of Numitor's faction, found their loyalty crumbling. Amulius, the king who thought he had drowned his problems in the Tiber, was caught and killed. The act was portrayed not as a murder, but as the execution of a tyrant, a necessary restoration of the natural order. With the usurper dead, Numitor was formally restored to the throne of Alba Longa. This moment completes a classic heroic cycle. The lost princes return, overthrow the evil uncle, and restore their noble grandfather. It is a clean, satisfying arc of justice, yet for Romulus and Remus, this victory created an unexpected dilemma. Their destiny was not to inherit a settled kingdom. Alba Longa was their past, not their future. In an act of remarkable filial piety, they refused to displace the grandfather they had just restored. They asked only for the right to take their followers and found a new city of their own on the very hills where the she-wolf had saved them. Numitor, grateful and perhaps understanding their restless ambition, granted their wish. He even sent sacred priests and rituals from Alba Longa to bless the new foundation. So the brothers turned their backs on a ready-made crown. They chose the wilderness over the palace, the risk of creation over the safety of inheritance. This decision, born of honor and ambition, set them free, but it also placed them on a blank slate with no old laws to guide them and no authority but their own. And on that empty plain between the hills, with power now solely in their own hands, the subtle rivalry between two equally proud founders would finally crack open. The hills along the Tiber were more than a home, they were a claim. Having restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, Romulus and Remus stood at a crossroads of destiny. They could have remained as honored princes in a settled, ancient city, living a life of comfort under Numitor's grateful rule, yet they chose the opposite. They turned their backs on inherited security and petitioned their grandfather for the right to lead their band of followers back to the wild Palatine and Aventine hills to build a new city from the ground up. This was a decision driven by a powerful, dual motivation. First, there was the undeniable pull of personal glory. To be a prince in an old kingdom was one thing, but to be the founder of a new one, to have your name echo through history as the creator of a people, that was a prize worth any risk. They were sons of Mars after all, and their blood craved achievement, not just inheritance. Second, and just as important, was their duty to their followers. These shepherds and outcasts had followed them through banditry and revolution. They were a new community forged in loyalty, not birth. To settle them as mere subjects in Alba Longa would have been a betrayal. They deserved their own land, their own laws, their own future. The place itself called to them. It was the site of their miraculous salvation by the she-wolf, the ground where Faustulus raised them, the hills they had defended and roamed. Founding their city, there was an act of profound closure, a way to sanctify their own strange story by building its monument. Numitor agreed, even providing sacred rites from Alba Longa to ensure the new foundation had the god's blessing. So, with everything seemingly settled, the brothers and their people returned to the Seven Hills, ready to begin. But an unspoken tension, simmering for years, now rose to the surface with terrifying speed. Both Romulus and Remus wanted to be the sole founder. This was not a minor dispute over duties, it was a primal conflict over identity and power. Whose name would the city bear? Who would give it laws, take the auspices, and wear the crown? Their shared triumph had masked a fundamental rivalry. They were twins in birth, equals in strength, and now competitors for the same eternal prize. The very idea of shared rule, of a city with two fathers, seemed impossible to them. Their followers, too, began to divide along loyalties, threatening to splinter the community before a single wall was built. With no higher human authority to appeal to, their grandfather now distant, they did what ancient peoples did when faced with an impossible choice. They agreed to seek a divine sign. The gods would decide. They would take the auspices, a sacred practice of reading the flight of birds, each brother standing on his chosen hill, Romulus on the Palatine and Remus on the Aventine. Whoever received the clearer, more powerful sign from heaven would be named the founder and king. It was a solemn pact, a way to avoid civil war before their city even existed. But in their hearts, each brother was already convinced of his own rightful claim. They separated to their hilltops, eyes turned to the empty sky, waiting for the birds to speak. The peace of their partnership now hung by the thinnest of threads, a thread that the slightest divine whisper would soon snap. The sky above the 7 hills was a vast, empty slate of blue, waiting for a divine signature. To settle their dispute, Romulus and Remus agreed to the most solemn method their world knew, the taking of the auspices. This was augury, the ancient art of interpreting the will of the gods through the flight and behavior of birds. It was not a superstition, but a formal state science for the Romans, a way to seek celestial approval for every major decision, from going to war to founding a city. The brothers separated to their chosen hills, each standing alone on a sacred space they had marked with a simple boundary trench. Romulus took his position on the Palatine, the hill of his childhood, while Remus stood atop the neighboring Aventine. Their followers waited in tense silence below, knowing the future of their entire community rested on the patterns of wings in the sky. They watched the horizon with a focused intensity, seeking a specific type of omen, the appearance of vultures. These birds were not symbols of death in this context, but of life and power, revered for their mastery of the sky and their commanding presence. The contest was simple. Whoever received the clearer, more favorable sign from the birds would be named the founder and king. The wait was agonizing. Then, a movement broke the stillness. According to the tradition recorded by the historian Livy, Remus was the first to see a sign. He spotted a flight of 6 vultures circling over the Aventine hill. His supporters erupted in triumphant shouts, declaring his victory. 6 was a significant number, a clear and positive omen. But the ritual was not yet over. Romulus, still watching from the Palatine, remained silent. Then, later, he saw his own sign, a flight of 12 vultures. His followers roared with an even greater fervor, claiming his omen was superior. And here lies the fatal ambiguity that ancient sources themselves debated. Which was more important, being first or having the greater number? Remus's camp argued that priority was everything. The gods had spoken to him first. Romulus's supporters countered that the magnitude of the sign, 12 being double 6, showed a fuller, more complete divine favor. This was not a minor theological debate. It was the crack that shattered their brotherhood. Both men were convinced of their own rightful claim, each believing the gods had validated his personal ambition. The shared purpose that had carried them from the riverbank to the overthrow of a king evaporated in the heat of this argument. There was no higher human authority to appeal to. Their grandfather was miles away in Alba Longa. The divine message meant to provide clarity had only sown deeper conflict. In their hearts, the contest was no longer about interpretation, it was about victory. And from this moment of disputed omens, the legend pivots inexorably from collaboration to a competition that could only end one way. The disputed omens left only one man standing on the sacred ground. Romulus, convinced the 12 vultures granted him divine favor, proceeded to found the city. But this was no simple act of marking territory. It was a ceremony of profound religious power, meant to transform wild earth into a sovereign state. He gathered his followers at the foot of the Palatine hill and prepared for the foundational ritual, the tracing of the pomerium. This was not a wall or a fence, but a sacred boundary, a line in the soil that separated the civilized from the chaotic, the ordered city from the untamed world. To mark it, Romulus used a bronze plow, a tool of cultivation, hitched to a pure white bull and a pure white cow. The choice of animals was deliberate, white symbolizing ritual purity, and the pairing of male and female representing the fertile potential of the new community. With solemn focus, he drove the plow in a wide, continuous circuit around the base of the Palatine, cutting a deep furrow into the earth. Every clod of soil turned by that bronze blade was consecrated. The furrow itself became the sacred limit, an invisible barrier believed to be charged with religious power. Wherever the line of the future city wall would run, this furrow was its spiritual precursor. But a city cannot be entirely closed. It needs entrances and exits. At the points where the gates were destined to be, Romulus performed a crucial symbolic act. He lifted the plow blade and carried it over the ground, breaking the continuous line. This created a threshold, a designated space where the sacred interior could be safely connected to the profane outside world without polluting the boundary's power. In that lifted plow, we see the birth of Roman law and religion intertwined. The pomerium was more than a property line, it was a legal and spiritual concept. Inside this boundary, only the gods of the city could be worshipped in their full state-sanctioned form. The authority of military command was restricted. Soldiers had to lay down their arms before crossing it. This single furrow established Rome not as a mere collection of huts, but as a templum, a consecrated space for observing the heavens and governing men. With this ritual, Romulus shifted from a mythic hero to a founding priest-king. He was no longer just marking where buildings would go, he was defining the very idea of what Rome would be, a place of order sanctified by the gods, forever separated from the wilderness that had once nurtured him. The sacred furrow was a line that could not be crossed. As Romulus completed the ritual, tracing the holy boundary of his new city, his brother Remus stood watching from the sidelines, a storm of resentment brewing within him. In his eyes, the entire ceremony was a fraud, a performance built on a stolen victory. The omens had been disputed, the divine will unclear, yet Romulus acted as if he alone held the mandate of heaven. To Remus, that freshly turned earth was not a sacred limit. It was a symbol of his brother's arrogance, a claim staked over land they had once ruled together as equals. His contempt needed an outlet, a way to prove the emptiness of Romulus's grand ritual. So, in a gesture of pure, defiant mockery, Remus stepped forward. He looked at his brother, at the plow, at the low wall of earth that was beginning to rise along the furrow's line, and then, with a single, scornful leap, he jumped over both. He crossed the pomerium. In that instant, the symbolic became horrifically real. To leap the sacred boundary was not just an insult, it was a sacrilege of the highest order. It threatened to undo the very magic of the foundation, to pollute the city before it drew its first breath. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Ancient sources disagree on who struck the fatal blow. Some, like the historian Livy, suggest it was a loyal follower of Romulus, a man named Sulla, whose name means swift, acting on his king's unspoken command. Others state plainly that Romulus himself, in a fury of righteous rage, struck down his own twin. The weapon was simple, a spade or a mattock, a builder's tool turned into an instrument of death. As Remus fell onto the very soil he had profaned, the legend attributes a chilling sentence to Romulus. He stood over his brother's body and declared, "So perish whoever else shall leap over my walls." This was more than a cry of anger, it was the first law of Rome. It established the absolute, inviolable authority of the founder and the state he was creating. The city's walls, both physical and spiritual, would be defended with lethal force. The murder of Remus was not a crime of passion in the modern sense, it was a foundational sacrifice. In the ancient mind, a city born without a sacred act of violence might be considered weak, unlucky, or illegitimate. The spilling of blood, especially royal, divine blood, was thought to consecrate the ground, to bind the fate of the place to the power of its gods. Romulus had just performed the ultimate act of sovereignty. He had proven that his authority, derived from the disputed augury, was now absolute and enforceable. He had transformed from a brother into a king, and his first royal decree was written in his twin's blood. This moment casts a long, dark shadow over everything that follows. Rome's origin is not a story of peaceful collaboration, but of fratricide. It suggests that the empire's legendary strength, its ruthless efficiency, and uncompromising laws were born from this very first act of lethal enforcement. The she-wolf's peaceful nourishment ends here at the edge of a furrow, replaced forever by the iron law of the wall. The blood on the new-turned earth demanded a city be built atop it. Alone now, Romulus stood as the undisputed founder, king, and lawgiver. He named the city after himself, Rome, and began the urgent work of construction on the Palatine hill. His band of shepherds became the first citizens, building huts, fortifying the sacred boundary, and establishing a rudimentary government. But a profound and immediate problem threatened the city's survival. Rome was a city of men. There were no women, no families, no way to ensure a second generation would be born within its new walls. A kingdom of bachelors would die with its founder. Romulus's first solution was diplomacy, an attempt to join the established order of the region. He sent envoys to the neighboring tribes, most notably the powerful Sabines who lived in the hills to the east. His proposal was straightforward and peaceful. He offered treaties of friendship and alliance, and he requested the right of intermarriage for Roman men to take Sabine women as wives. This was a normal, civilized practice for new communities seeking legitimacy, but the neighboring tribes saw Rome not as a legitimate kingdom, but as a dangerous anomaly. To them, Romulus and his followers were not the sons of a god. They were a rabble of bandits, outcasts, and now fratricides. The memory of their cattle raids was fresh. Who would send their daughters into a city founded on an act of brother murder? The refusals were swift and contemptuous. The Sabines and others dismissed the envoys, some even mocking the request. They saw Rome as a blight, a temporary camp of violent men that would soon dissolve. This rejection placed Romulus in an impossible bind. Peaceful integration had been denied. His city and his legacy faced extinction within a single lifetime unless he found another path. But even as this crisis with the neighbors brewed, Romulus was already solving the population problem from another, more radical angle. He turned not to the established tribes, but to the dispossessed. On the Capitoline Hill, the steep, fortified height adjacent to the Palatine, Romulus formally established an asylum. This was a sacred zone of refuge, a place where the law of the outside world did not apply. He sent out a proclamation far and wide, inviting any man who was homeless, exiled, enslaved, or fleeing blood vengeance to come to Rome. Here he promised they would find safety, freedom, and a new start. The response was a flood of humanity. Runaway slaves, debtors, criminals, and political exiles from across Latium streamed into the new city. This single policy solved the manpower issue dramatically. Rome's population exploded overnight, but it also created the community's defining character and its greatest weakness. Rome was now a city built not from a single tribe, but from fragments of many. It was a volatile mix of the desperate and the ambitious, bound together by no common past, only by the promise of a future from their king. They owed everything to Romulus, which secured their fierce loyalty. Yet, to the surrounding peoples, this asylum confirmed their worst fears. Rome was not just a band of shepherds, it was a magnet for every dangerous and ruthless man in the land. This volatile energy, this desperate need for wives and legitimacy, now churned within the new walls. The peaceful overtures had failed. The asylum had created a powerful, restless, and entirely male citizen body. All the conditions were now in place for an event that would move from diplomacy to deception, and from deception to one of the most famous conflicts in all of legend. Romulus declared a great festival in honor of the god Consus, a deity of the harvest and the stored grain. Messengers carried invitations across the plains and hills, extending a hand of friendship to all the neighboring peoples, especially the Sabines from the town of Cures. This was a public spectacle of peace, a chance to showcase Rome's growing strength and its desire for goodwill. Families came in great numbers, men, women, and children, curious to see this new settlement and partake in the games and sacrifices. The atmosphere was one of celebration, not suspicion. As the festivities reached their peak, with everyone's attention fixed on the chariot races and athletic contests, Romulus gave a pre-arranged signal. He simply stood and draped his cloak over his shoulders. In that instant, the trap was sprung. Young Roman men who had been mingling casually in the crowd suddenly erupted into violence. They did not attack the men. Their target was specific and horrifying. They rushed upon the unmarried Sabine women, seizing them by the arms and dragging them away from their screaming families. The festival ground dissolved into absolute chaos. Fathers and brothers tried to fight back, but they were unarmed and outnumbered. The Romans, acting on a coordinated plan, fought their way through the panicked crowd, carrying their struggling prizes back into the fortified heart of the city. The gates of Rome were slammed shut, leaving the outraged Sabine men outside, pounding on the walls and vowing a terrible revenge. This event is known to history as the rape of the Sabine women, though the ancient word rape here carries its older meaning of abduction or seizure, a theft of persons. Was this a calculated strategy or a heinous crime? The myth itself seems to wrestle with this question. On one level, it is a story of profound criminality, a brutal violation of hospitality and trust that paints early Rome as a community of pirates and liars. The betrayal of the sacred festival piece is a dark stain, yet the ancient Romans who told this story also framed it as a painful but necessary act of survival. With all diplomatic requests for intermarriage refused, the city faced extinction. The abduction, in this harsh logic, was a desperate solution to an existential crisis. This duality is key to understanding the legend's purpose. It is an etiological tale, a story crafted to explain origins. It accounts for the mixed ethnic composition of early Rome, showing how Sabine bloodlines were forcibly woven into the Roman people from the very beginning. It also sets the stage for Rome's future relations with its neighbors, born not from peaceful trade but from conflict, negotiation, and eventual integration. Later Roman writers even added a fascinating layer of mitigation. They claimed Romulus himself addressed the captured women, promising them legal marriage, property rights, and full citizenship. He argued that the offense lay not with the Romans, but with their fathers who had denied them this union. Whether this speech was ever given is irrelevant. Its inclusion shows a later society grappling with its own foundational violence, trying to soften the crime into a harsh romance. The event, therefore, stands as a paradox. It is both the city's original sin and the pragmatic seed of its future strength. A brutal act that would ironically lead to Rome's first great merger and the creation of a dual people. The stolen women were now the city's only hope for a future. Their abduction ignited a fire of vengeance that would consume the plains between the hills. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, was a ruler of formidable reputation, and the insult to his people demanded a response of overwhelming force. He did not act alone. Outrage over the violation of sacred hospitality had spread, and Tatius rallied not only the full might of the Sabines from Cures, but also allied forces from other Latin towns who saw Rome as a growing, lawless threat. Their combined army marched on the new city, its purpose clear: to destroy Rome, rescue the women, and erase Romulus's experiment from the earth. The Romans, for their part, were prepared. They had fortified the Palatine, but a defensive siege was not their style. Romulus led his men, the same band of shepherds and asylum seekers, out to meet the enemy in the open ground that would one day become the Roman Forum. This was not yet a grand public square, but a marshy valley between the fortified hills. Here, in this confined space, the two armies clashed. The battle was a brutal, close-quarters struggle, a chaos of bronze shields and thrusting spears where the fate of a civilization would be decided in the mud. The fighting was fierce and evenly matched, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The air filled with the din of clashing metal, war cries, and the screams of the wounded. As the lines surged back and forth, the ground grew slick with blood. It seemed the conflict could only end with the utter annihilation of one people by the other. Then a new force entered the fray, one armed not with swords but with desperation and love. The Sabine women, who had lived in Rome for some time now, had not remained passive prisoners. According to Livy, they had become wives in truth, and many had borne children to their Roman husbands. They heard the terrible sounds of battle from their homes. They knew their fathers and brothers were outside the walls fighting to reclaim them, and they knew their husbands were inside those walls fighting to keep them. The thought of losing either was unbearable. In a moment of collective courage that has echoed for millennia, they made a decision. With their infant children in their arms or clutching at their skirts, they rushed from the safety of their homes. They did not flee the city, they ran directly toward the heart of the violence. They pushed through the chaos, their hair loosened in grief, their cries piercing the noise of war. They ran into the very no-man's land between the two battle lines, placing themselves and their babies directly in the path of the spears. The sight was so shocking, so utterly unprecedented, that the fighting around them stuttered to a halt. Men from both sides lowered their weapons, stunned into silence. Then the women began to speak. Their leader, a woman named Hercilia, who had become Romulus's own wife, pleaded with both armies. She cried out to their Sabine fathers, asking if they had come to make them orphans twice over, to kill the husbands who were now the fathers of their grandchildren. She turned to the Romans and asked if they sought to widow the mothers of their own children. Their speech was a masterpiece of emotional logic, a raw articulation of a terrible bind. "We are the cause of this war," they declared, "and we will be the victims of its outcome. If you fight, you do not fight each other, you fight through us. Kill our husbands and we are widows, kill our fathers and we are orphans. Either way, you condemn us and these children to a life of misery. Which is the greater crime, to live with the men who took us or to die without the fathers who lost us?" Their words, amplified by the wails of their infants, broke the spell of battle rage. A profound shame settled over the warriors. What was the point of this slaughter? To rescue women who no longer wished to be rescued in that way, to defend a city that would be left a city of widows and fatherless children. The weapons felt heavy and pointless in their hands. King Titus Tatius and Romulus, moved by this incredible intervention, stepped forward. They saw not just a path to peace, but a greater opportunity. In that moment of stillness, a treaty was forged not just to end a war, but to unite two peoples. The Sabines would not destroy Rome, nor would the Romans surrender the women. Instead, they would merge. The Sabine men, their families, and their entire community would be invited to settle in Rome, receiving full citizenship and rights. The city would be co-ruled by two kings, Romulus and Titus Tatius, a dual monarchy that reflected this new, blended identity. The Sabines would occupy the Capitoline and Quirinal hills, integrating their gods, their customs, and their blood into the fabric of the state. This was the true founding of the Roman people, not as a tribe of bandits, but as a union of Latins and Sabines. The war that began with a theft ended with a wedding of nations, all because the women, caught in the middle, refused to be merely the prize. The union of Romans and Sabines created a powerful but inherently fragile kingdom. For several years, Romulus and Titus Tatius ruled together as a diarchy, a rare experiment in shared kingship. This was not a true partnership of equals, but a practical arrangement to keep the peace between two recently warring peoples. Each king maintained his own residence, his own followers, and his own sphere of influence within the newly expanded city. The Sabines lived largely on the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, following their own customs and worshipping their own gods, like the war deity Quirinus, who would later become deeply significant. This system worked, but it was a balancing act, a temporary solution to blend two distinct cultures under one name. The tension of this divided authority could not last, and its end came not from within Rome's walls, but from a distant altar and an act of misplaced loyalty. The kings had traveled to the ancient Latin city of Lavinium to conduct a solemn public sacrifice. During the ceremonies, a group of ambassadors from the neighboring Laurentine people arrived, accusing some of Titus Tatius's own Sabine companions of robbing them. They demanded justice. Tatius, perhaps feeling the pressure to defend his men and uphold his personal authority in front of his co-king and the Latin allies, reacted with fierce partisanship. He shielded the accused and dismissed the Laurentines' complaints. This was a grave political miscalculation, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality and diplomacy that were supposed to govern relations between cities, especially during a religious festival. The insulted Laurentines did not forget. As the sacrifice concluded and the crowds dispersed, they saw their chance. In the ensuing chaos, they attacked Titus Tatius. The Sabine king was struck down and killed right there on the sacred ground. His allies, the very men he had protected, fled or were killed alongside him. Romulus, remarkably, was left unharmed. The sources are silent on why he was spared, but the implication is stark. The Laurentines saw the crime as personal to Tatius, not an act against Rome itself. With a single, violent act in a foreign city, the delicate diarchy was shattered. Romulus returned to Rome alone, the sole king once more, but he did not return to the small band of shepherds he had first led. He now ruled a united populace of Romans and Sabines, a people who had fought a war and then forged a peace through their women's courage. The death of his co-ruler, tragic and sudden, had an ironic effect. It solidified Rome. There was no longer a division of loyalties, no separate Sabine power base within the state. All citizens, Latin and Sabine alike, now looked to a single figure for leadership. This consolidated power allowed Romulus to build with a new focus. His reign became a period of intense institution building, laying the administrative and military foundations that would last for centuries. He understood that a city born from violence and fusion needed structure to survive. To organize his people for war and government, he created the first formal divisions of the Roman population. He established 3 tribes not based on ethnicity but on geography and function within the city. The Ramnes were named for Romulus himself, likely comprising the original Latin settlers on the Palatine. The Tities were named for Titus Tatius, honoring the Sabine contingent on the Quirinal. The third tribe, the Luceres, is more mysterious, its name of uncertain origin, possibly representing a later group of Etruscan immigrants or other early arrivals assigned to the third hill, the Caelian. Each of these 3 tribes was then subdivided into 10 smaller units called curiae, making 30 in total. Think of the curiae as the fundamental building blocks of early Roman society, something like wards or parishes. Each curia had its own meeting place, its own religious rites, and its own leaders. They were the units for raising soldiers, for voting in the early popular assembly, and for conducting censuses. When Romulus needed an army, he did not call on individuals. He called on each curia to provide a century of infantry, 100 men, and a squadron of cavalry, 10 horsemen. This system transformed a mixed population into an organized state. It provided a clear chain of command, a method for collective decision-making, and a way to distribute duties and honors. Through these tribes and curiae, every citizen had a defined place, a role in the community's military and religious life. This was the true genius of Romulus's later rule. He channeled the volatile energy of his asylum seekers and the proud independence of the Sabines into a stable, scalable framework for power. The city was no longer just a fortress on a hill. It was becoming a machine for conquest and administration. But as his institutions grew stronger, the man at their center became more distant, more regal, and more shrouded in mystery, setting the stage for an ending as sudden and supernatural as his beginning. The institutions he built would outlast him, but the man himself would not. Romulus's reign stretched into decades, a long period of consolidation and warfare that solidified Rome's power. Yet, as he aged, the nature of his rule began to shift. The charismatic leader of shepherds, the co-king of the Sabines, increasingly governed with the absolute authority of a monarch who brooked no challenge. He surrounded himself with a personal guard of 300 men called the Sellers, named for Seller, the man who struck down Remus. This act alone spoke volumes about his growing isolation and the fear that now underpinned his power. The Senate, the council of elders he had once consulted, found their influence waning. Romulus made decisions alone, dressed in royal purple, and held the power of life and death over every citizen. The very men who had helped him build Rome began to murmur. Was this the city of laws and shared citizenship they had fought for, or was it becoming the private kingdom of a tyrant? The tension between the founder and the founded simmered just beneath the surface of Rome's growing strength. Then, in the 37th year of his reign, during a military review at a place called the Goat's Marsh, everything changed. Romulus was addressing his troops, inspecting the legions that were his greatest creation, when the sky darkened without warning. A violent storm descended upon the field, a tempest of such ferocious wind and blinding rain that the soldiers scattered in panic, shielding their faces from the stinging dust. The air crackled with an unnatural energy. When the storm passed as suddenly as it had come, the field was empty. Romulus was gone, not a trace of him remained. His throne sat vacant. In that moment of collective shock, the legend of Romulus fractured into two irreconcilable truths, each revealing a different face of Rome's memory. The official state narrative, promoted for centuries afterward, was one of divine apotheoses. A respected senator named Julius Proculus came forward with a solemn testimony. He claimed that Romulus had appeared to him in a vision, radiant and majestic, clad in gleaming armor. The founder declared that it was the will of the gods that he be taken from Earth. He had been carried up to the heavens by his father, Mars, to be received among the immortal deities. From on high, he said, he would watch over his city forever under his new name, Quirinus. This story was not merely a comforting tale, it was a political and religious necessity. It provided a sacred, unassailable conclusion to the life of the founder, preventing a destabilizing crisis of succession. It transformed Romulus from a mortal king into a state god, a protector whose temple on the Quirinal hill would become a site of official worship. The deification served a profound purpose. It made the founder eternal and the city's destiny divinely ordained. But another story persisted in whispers, a darker counter-narrative that refused to be silenced by official decree. This was the senatorial version, the rumor of murder. According to this account, the senators themselves had grown weary of Romulus's autocratic rule. They saw not a god-king, but a despot who distributed war spoils as he pleased, who ignored their counsel, and who ruled by fear. The military review at the Goat's Marsh was not the scene of a miracle, but of a conspiracy. In the chaos of that manufactured storm, the senators closed in. They surrounded Romulus, attacked him, and killed him. Then, to hide their crime and prevent the creation of a martyr's tomb, they dismembered his body. Each senator concealed a piece beneath his toga, smuggling the fragments away until nothing remained. This version paints a picture of a foundational regicide, a primal act of political resistance where the governing body destroys the very king who created it. This duality, the apotheosis and the murder, is the perfect, unresolved coda to Romulus's story. It captures the essential mystery of his legacy. Was he the divine father, beloved of the gods, or was he a tyrant torn apart by the men he trusted? The Romans never fully chose one story over the other. They held both in tension. In doing so, they acknowledged a complex truth about power. The The state requires founding myths of divine favor and eternal guardianship to ensure its stability and inspire its people. Yet, beneath that polished surface, the memory of real human conflict, ambition, and violence always lingers. The disappearance of Romulus, in all its contradictory glory and horror, reminds us that the birth of a state is never a clean, holy event. It is a human drama written in blood and sanctified by stories, where the line between a god and a corpse is drawn not by truth, but by those who remain to tell the tale. The throne sat empty and the city held its breath. With Romulus vanished into myth or buried in secret, Rome faced its first true constitutional crisis. Who could possibly follow a figure who was either a god or a murdered king? The answer was not a person, but a process, one born from necessity and clever political design. The original 100 patricians the senators Romulus had appointed stepped into the power vacuum. They did not crown a new king immediately. Instead, they instituted a system called the interregnum, which literally means between reigns. Power rotated among them in 5-day intervals, with one senator acting as a temporary guardian of the state. This rotating leadership was a brilliant, pragmatic solution. It prevented any single aristocrat from seizing power and plunging the city into civil war. More importantly, it gave the Senate time to deliberate, to argue, and to seek the will of the gods for a suitable successor. The interregnum lasted for an entire year, a period of intense negotiation and reflection. What kind of king did Rome need now? The city founded by the son of Mars, forged in the abduction of the Sabines and solidified by constant warfare, was strong but brittle. It was all sword and no shield. The senators, both Latin and Sabine, recognized this imbalance. They needed a ruler who could build what Romulus could not, a society of laws, rituals, and internal peace. Their gaze turned away from the warlords of the plains and settled on a most unlikely candidate, a Sabine man named Numa Pompilius. He lived not in a palace or a fortress, but in the quiet Sabine town of Cures, a community known for its traditional piety and just laws. Numa was a scholar and a recluse, a man who spent his days in contemplation, studying philosophy and the sacred rites of the ancient world. He was married to the nymph Egeria, a divine spirit of a spring who, legend says, was his counselor and the source of his profound wisdom. When the Roman senators arrived with their offer of kingship, Numa famously refused. He had no desire for power or public life. It took repeated, persuasive embassies to finally convince him that his duty lay not in personal comfort, but in answering the city's profound need. His ascension was a deliberate, symbolic reset. Where Romulus took power through augury and force, Numa accepted it through reluctant duty. Where Romulus celebrated war, Numa worshipped peace. His first act as king was to dismiss the personal bodyguard of sellers that Romulus had kept, sending a clear message that his authority would be based on consent and respect, not fear. Numa Pompilius understood that to tame a city of soldiers, he must appeal to a higher power. He dedicated his 43-year reign to the systematic establishment of Roman religion, creating the framework of piety that would become the empire's spiritual backbone. He founded the Temple of Janus, its doors to be open in times of war and closed in times of peace. Under Numa, those doors remained shut for his entire reign, an unprecedented feat. He organized the priests into distinct colleges, like the pontifices who oversaw the calendar and public rituals, and the Vestal virgins, whom he placed under strict, sacred vows, elevating their role as guardians of Rome's eternal flame and its moral heart. He reformed the calendar, aligning it with the solar year and designating which days were auspicious for public business and which were not, thus bringing the chaotic rhythm of human affairs into harmony with the divine order. Every month, every festival, every sacrifice was given a structure and a meaning. This was not mere superstition, it was statecraft. By weaving religion into the very fabric of daily life and civic identity, Numa gave the restless Romans a common purpose that was not conquest. He gave them rituals that fostered unity, laws that promoted stability, and a fear of the gods that was stronger than their fear of each other. In this, the Romans saw the brilliant complement to their founder. They came to believe their greatness sprang from two foundational pillars, embodied by their first two kings. From Romulus, they inherited virtus, that essential masculine courage, the valor in battle, the fierce spirit of expansion and survival. From Numa, they inherited pietas, the sacred duty to the gods, to the state, and to one's family, the solemn respect for tradition and law that held society together. One king built the army, the other built the priesthood. One defined the frontier, the other defined the forum. Romulus gave them the sword arm, Numa gave them the moral compass. This duality became the core of the Roman self-image, the belief that they were destined to rule not just because they were the strongest, but because they were the most pious, the most devoted to correct ritual and divine favor. The violent, miraculous birth under Romulus required the peaceful, systematic nurturing under Numa to become a civilization. It prompts a fascinating question about national character. Can a people known for ruthless conquest truly believe their success was granted by the gods because of their piety? The Romans did, and that belief, seated in the contrast between a warlord and a priest-king, would propel them for centuries. But this delicate balance between war and peace would not last, for the world beyond their hills was not so pious, and the next king would remind them that virtus always has its price. The divine disappearance of Romulus left a city balanced between two ideals, but what of the ground itself? Beneath the marble ruins of imperial Rome, the soil of the Palatine hill holds a more tangible truth. For over a century, archaeologists have peeled back the layers of legend, and what they have found is not a she-wolf's den or a royal palace, but something far more humble and telling. Cut into the bedrock are the clear, geometric patterns of post holes, the foundational ghosts of simple huts. These are not random pits, they form distinct oval or rectangular footprints, the unmistakable blueprint of dwellings from a specific time, the 8th century before the Common Era. This date is not a coincidence. It aligns precisely with the traditional year the Romans themselves gave for their city's founding, 753 BCE. The correlation is startling, a point where archaeology and myth seem to shake hands across the millennia. These were not permanent structures of stone or brick. They were built from materials the early settlers would have had at hand. Archaeologists call it wattle and daub. Imagine a framework of wooden posts driven deep into those very holes, with flexible branches woven between them like a basket to create the walls. This wattle frame was then plastered over with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, a daub that dried hard in the sun, providing insulation and protection. The roofs were likely thatched with reeds from the nearby Tiber marshes. Stepping inside would have meant a single room, dark and smoky from a central hearth, the floor simply packed earth. This is the authentic texture of Rome's origin, a far cry from the grandeur of the later empire. It paints a picture of a small, struggling pastoral community, exactly the kind of settlement described in the legend's quieter moments. These were farmers and shepherds living in family groups, tending flocks on the slopes of the hills and cultivating small plots in the valleys. Their world was defined by the daily struggle for survival, not by dreams of empire. This archaeological evidence does not prove a man named Romulus killed a man named Remus. It will never confirm a she-wolf's intervention. What it does is anchor the myth's core geography to a verified historical reality. The legend insists the city began on the Palatine hill, and the oldest physical traces of a settlement are right there on that same hill from that exact era. The story of the twins, then, feels like a magnificent embroidery stitched onto a plain, sturdy fabric. The fabric is real, the foundational community of huts. The glorious, bloody, divine narrative is the intricate pattern woven upon it, a story created to explain how this cluster of simple homes became something destined to rule the world. So we are left with a powerful synthesis. The myth gives the event its soul, its drama, and its moral meaning. The archaeology gives it its body, its time, and its place. One is a story of supernatural destiny, the other is a record of human endeavor. Together, they suggest that every great legend, no matter how fantastical, begins with a seed of truth, a real place where people once lived, built fires, and dreamed of something greater than their humble huts. That simple hut on the Palatine was not the only sacred ground. At the very foot of the hill, nestled where the slope met the marshy ground of the future forum, lay a place of wild, ancient power, the Lupercal cave. This was no ordinary grotto. For centuries, it served as the central sanctuary for one of Rome's oldest and most bizarre festivals, the Lupercalia. Every year on February 15th, a strange ritual unfolded. Priests known as the Luperci, naked except for goatskin loincloths, would gather at this cave. They would sacrifice goats and a dog, animals associated with fertility and protection. Then, smeared with the blood of the sacrifice and clad in the fresh skins, they would run a circuit around the base of the Palatine hill, striking any women they encountered with strips of goatskin. Far from being an offense, this was believed to promote fertility and ease childbirth. The festival was raw, chaotic, and dripping with primal energy, a direct link to the wilderness that had once surrounded the city. The connection to the myth was explicit. This cave was venerated as the very spot where the she-wolf, the Lupa, had suckled Romulus and Remus. Here, the abstract legend became a physical location for cult worship. The Lupercalia was a reenactment of that foundational moment of wild nourishment, a way for the sophisticated Romans of the Republic and Empire to touch the feral origins of their state. It was a ritual of paradox, celebrating the animalistic birth of a civilization that now ruled the world with laws and legions. For generations, the exact location of this legendary cave was lost, buried under the monumental palaces of later emperors. Then, in 2007, during a routine archaeological survey of the Palace of Augustus, workers made a stunning discovery. 16 meters beneath the imperial foundations, their cameras revealed a hidden chamber. It was a vaulted grotto, nearly 8 meters high and decorated with stunning, well-preserved mosaics. The walls and ceiling were covered in seashells, colored marble, and pumice stone, arranged into intricate geometric patterns and niches. At its center was a depiction of a majestic white eagle, the symbol of Jupiter, king of the gods. The sophistication of the decoration suggested this was no mere storage cellar, but a sacred space of immense importance, carefully preserved and sealed by Augustus himself. While no inscription bears the name Lupercal, the location is perfect, right at the foot of the Palatine where tradition always placed it. The lavish decoration by Rome's first emperor makes profound sense. Augustus, who came to power after a brutal civil war, dedicated his reign to restoring Rome's traditional values and linking his rule directly to its glorious origins. What better way to legitimize his new dynasty than to build his palace directly over the city's mythical birthplace, and to personally restore and enshrine the very cave of the she-wolf? He wasn't just preserving a hole in the ground, he was architecturally claiming descent from Romulus. This discovery gives us a breathtaking glimpse into how the Romans themselves viewed their myth. The Lupercal was not a forgotten fairy tale. It was a tangible, sacred site that emperors felt the need to protect and monumentalize. It served as a physical anchor, a place where the foundational story of wild twins and a nurturing wolf could be visited, worshipped, and politically exploited. The cave bridged the gap between the humble postholes of the first settlers and the glorious marble narratives of the empire, proving that for Rome, history was always a living thing, built layer upon layer, with myth holding up the very foundations of power. The myth of the twins is more than a story. It is a political blueprint in narrative form. Every character and conflict maps onto the real, messy process of building a people from disparate groups. Look at the three foundational layers the legend encodes. First, the Latin core. Romulus and Remus are descendants of Aeneas, a Trojan hero, through their Alban grandfather Numitor. This establishes a prestigious, ancient lineage connecting Rome to the wider Mediterranean world, but their immediate identity is Latin from the hills south of the Tiber. They represent the original settlers, the tribes who first built huts on the Palatine. Second, the vital Sabine layer. This is not a minor addition, it is a full merger dramatized through the abduction of the women and the war that follows. The Sabines were not enemies, they were powerful neighbors whose integration was essential for Rome's survival and strength. The legend turns a probable long process of negotiation, intermarriage, and conflict into a single, memorable epic of war and reconciliation. The shared kingship of Romulus and Titus Tatius is a perfect metaphor for this political and cultural fusion. Finally, the asylum. Romulus's open invitation to outcasts and fugitives addresses a historical reality many later Romans found embarrassing. Early Rome's population did swell with the displaced, the indebted, and the ambitious from other communities. The myth reframes this potentially shameful origin into a deliberate, divinely sanctioned policy of strength through inclusion. It says these men were not a rabble, they were chosen, welcome to build something new. Together, these three strands created a society uniquely equipped for expansion. Unlike the Greeks, who often defined themselves by blood purity and exclusivity, the Roman identity was from the start a civic one, based on shared law and ritual rather than pure ethnicity. You could become Roman. This was their revolutionary genius, and the legend of Romulus and Remus provides the sacred justification for it. The story transforms potential sources of tension, the friction between Latins and Sabines, the distrust of newcomers, into a unified national narrative. It says our strength comes from our mixture, our founding was an act of synthesis. The murder of Remus, then, might be read as the tragic but necessary cost of this unity, the moment the old model of shared, equal leadership had to die for a new, singular Roman identity to be born. This syncretism echoes in everything that followed, from their willingness to adopt foreign gods into their pantheon to their policy of granting citizenship to conquered peoples. The legend taught them that to absorb others was not to weaken but to become greater. It was a founding myth that actively encouraged its own reinvention. That cave's rediscovery shows how the Romans monumentalized their own myth, but one artifact has come to symbolize the entire story for the modern world. In the heart of Rome, inside the Capitoline museums, stands a bronze statue of breathtaking intensity. It is the Capitoline wolf. She stands alert, her body tense and lean, her neck arched forward, her ears pricked for danger. Her muzzle is drawn back in a subtle snarl, bearing sharp teeth, a portrait of fierce, protective motherhood, and beneath her, two small human infants crane upward to nurse. This image is so iconic it feels eternal, the definitive illustration of the legend. Yet this statue holds a fascinating secret of its own. The powerful, majestic wolf is ancient, but the twins beneath her are a much later addition. Art historians and metallurgic analysis suggest the wolf herself likely dates not from the time of Romulus, but from the medieval period, possibly the 11th or 12th century, or may even be an Etruscan work from centuries earlier. The figures of Romulus and Remus, however, were crafted and added during the Italian Renaissance, nearly 1500 years after Rome's founding. This means the most famous depiction of the city's birth is itself a hybrid, a fusion of different eras and artistic visions, layered together to create a perfect symbol. That fact does not diminish its power, it deepens it. The statue is not a historical document, but a testament to the legend's enduring grip on the human imagination. For centuries, this bronze wolf served as a potent political emblem. During the Middle Ages, it was displayed on the Capitoline Hill, the ancient seat of Roman government, as a symbol of civic authority and justice. It reminded citizens that their laws and communal identity sprang from that primal, wild origin. Later, in the Renaissance, popes and princes used the image to link their own rule to the glory and legitimacy of ancient Rome. By adding the twins, Renaissance artists literally completed the story, emphasizing the human outcome of the wolf's salvation, the birth of the founders. The statue became a visual shorthand, a single, unforgettable emblem that could convey the entire complex narrative of destiny, survival, and ruthless ambition. It demonstrates how every age molds foundational myths to serve its own purposes. The medieval city-state saw in the wolf a guardian of communal law. The Renaissance prince saw in the twins a divine right to rule. The statue transcends its own components to become a mirror, reflecting back whatever values a society needs to see in its origin story. So when we look at the Capitoline wolf today, we are not looking at a relic from the 8th century before the Common Era. We are looking at a conversation across time, a medieval or Etruscan artist's vision of animal power, fused with a Renaissance interpretation of human destiny, all united to represent an idea that is forever Roman. This artifact proves that the legend's true power lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its endless adaptability, its capacity to mean something essential to people separated by millennia. Romulus was never just a figure from the distant past. He lived in the Roman imagination as both a shining model and a dark warning, a reflection of their own deepest ambitions and fears. To later generations, he was the ultimate paradox. He was the son of Mars, the pious founder who traced the sacred boundary and established the first laws. Yet he was also the brother who killed Remus, the king who grew autocratic, surrounded by bodyguards and ignoring the Senate. This duality made him the perfect, flexible symbol for Roman politics. A leader could invoke the heroic Romulus to claim divine favor and the right to reshape the state, but his critics could just as easily invoke the tyrannical Romulus to condemn overreach and ambition. This is precisely what happened during the death throes of the Republic. Julius Caesar, in his relentless climb to power, openly embraced the comparison. He hinted at a divine lineage, and after his military victories, the Senate permitted him to wear a purple toga like the ancient kings, and even authorized a statue of him with an inscription linking him to a descendant of Venus and the son of Mars. More boldly, he allowed coins to be minted showing his own profile alongside the she-wolf and twins. Caesar was not just celebrating the founding myth, he was inserting himself into it, suggesting his rule was a natural, even destined, continuation of Rome's origins. His adopted heir, Augustus, learned from this playbook but applied its lessons with far more subtlety and caution. After Caesar's assassination for acting too kingly, Augustus understood he had to walk a razor's edge. He needed the authority of a founder without the stigma of a tyrant. He famously refused the title of dictator or king, instead taking the carefully crafted name Augustus, meaning the revered one. Yet he quietly encouraged associations with Romulus. He lived in a house on the Palatine hill, the very site of the founder's hut. He restored the Lupercal cave, physically linking his residence to the mythical birthplace. Most tellingly, the Senate offered him the name Romulus, a title he wisely declined as too overt and dangerous. He accepted instead a crown of oak leaves, the civic crown for saving citizens, and the honor of having the month sextiles renamed July after his uncle, and later his own month, August. His genius was in evoking the founder's spirit while avoiding his bloody reputation. He became the new Romulus, but a Romulus who brought peace, not one who killed his brother. This careful manipulation shows how the myth could be sanitized for new purposes, but the dark side of the legend remained a potent weapon for those out of power. The orator Cicero, in his fiery speeches against Mark Antony, wielded the negative Romulus like a dagger. He did not call Antony a new Romulus that would have granted him too much dignity. Instead, he evoked the founder's worst traits to paint Antony as a monster. He compared Antony's violent and lawless behavior to the fratricide. his disregard for the Senate to the king's arrogance, and his drunken revelries to the corruption of royal power. Cicero asked the Roman people, "Do you wish to be ruled by a man who resembles not the glorious founder, but the murderous tyrant that founder became?" In this rhetorical move, the legend was not a source of legitimacy, but a mirror held up to shame. The story of Romulus and Remus was thus a political language, a set of symbols that could argue either side of Rome's eternal debate between order and liberty, between the need for a strong leader and the fear of a despot. It taught every Roman that the very qualities that could build an empire, the ruthless decisiveness, the unwavering claim to divine right, also contained the seed of its destruction. The founder's shadow was long, and every man who sought to walk in it had to decide which version of him they would become. The shadow of that first murder stretches far beyond ancient politics. Modern thinkers have peered into the dark waters of the Tiber and seen not just a historical event, but a timeless psychological drama. The fratricide of Remus is often interpreted as a powerful metaphor for civil strife, the moment a community turns its violence inward upon itself. Psychologists and mythologists like Sigmund Freud might view it as a foundational trauma, a primal story that encodes the inevitable conflict between brothers, between order and chaos, or between the individual's ambition and the needs of the collective. Romulus, in this reading, represents the establishment of law and civilization, but he does so at a terrible cost by destroying the part of himself, his own twin, that represents rebellion, freedom, or a different vision. The myth suggests that civilization itself is born from an act of suppression, that to build walls you must first silence the voice that questions them. This internal conflict echoes in every society that has ever torn itself apart in civil war, a reminder that the enemy is sometimes not a foreign invader, but the brother who shares your blood and your history, yet dreams of a different city. This psychological depth gives the legend immense weight in political theory, where it becomes a stark case study on the origin of sovereignty and the social contract. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, saw in Romulus a brutal but necessary truth. In his famous work Leviathan, Hobbes argued that in a state of nature without government, human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this chaos, people must surrender their individual freedoms to a single, absolute sovereign power, a Leviathan who will impose order and guarantee security. The killing of Remus from this grim perspective is the foundational moment of that contract. Romulus becomes the sovereign, and his lethal enforcement of the city boundary is the first act of state power. The message is clear: transgress the law, challenge the sovereign's authority, and you will be removed even if you are family. The peace and order of the city, Hobbes might argue, are literally built upon the corpse of the dissenter. This is a far cry from the peaceful social contracts imagined by other philosophers. It presents sovereignty not as a gentle agreement, but as a violent imposition that must be accepted for survival's sake. The legend forces us to ask a disturbing question: does all political order ultimately rest on a foundational act of violence, a sacrifice we choose to forget in exchange for safety? You do not need to open a philosophy textbook to encounter this story, for it has seeped into the bedrock of our popular culture. The narrative bones of Romulus and Remus are endlessly recycled, proving their raw archetypal power. In film and television, from the epic scale of movies like Foundation to the familial conflicts in Game of Thrones, we see the same dynamics: brothers divided by ambition, founders making terrible choices for their people, cities born in blood. Video games, particularly strategy titles like the Civilization series, literally task you with being Romulus, making the foundational choices of law, religion, and warfare to guide a tribe into an empire. The twins' names themselves orbit the world of Star Trek, where the planets Romulus and Remus are home to a divided, imperialistic alien species. the Romulans and their enslaved brethren, the Remans, translating the ancient earthly conflict into a galactic saga of domination and rebellion. In literature, from Shakespeare's histories to modern fantasy, the motif of the feuding twins or the city built on a dark secret is a perennial theme. Each retelling, whether direct or subconscious, uses the framework to explore contemporary anxieties about power, identity, and the price of unity. The legend persists because it is not about ancient Rome alone, it is a template. It is a story we return to whenever we must confront the uncomfortable origins of our own communities, the violence buried under our laws, and the eternal tension between the dream of a peaceful foundation and the bloody reality of how walls actually get built. The legend of Rome's birth is a story told in two languages. One is the language of myth, of divine wolves and vanished kings, speaking of destiny and divine favor. The other is the language of the soil, of post holes and pottery shards, whispering of humble huts and a hardscrabble beginning. Our journey has moved between these two realms, showing they are not rivals, but partners in a profound historical conversation. The peaceful story of the twins nurtured by a she-wolf was never the whole truth. It was the beautiful, sanctioned surface of a much deeper and darker well. That well contained the violence of fratricide, the trauma of abduction, and the pragmatic brutality of political murder. These were not later corruptions of a pure tale. They were foundational ingredients baked into the narrative from the start. The Romans crafted this complex legend because they needed it to do real work. It had to explain the puzzling mix of peoples in their city, hence the Sabine War and the open asylum. It had to justify the harsh, uncompromising authority of the state, hence the lethal enforcement of the first wall by Romulus. It had to provide a divine pedigree for their staggering success, hence the sons of Mars and the apotheoses into the sky. And it had to offer a cautionary tale about the dangers of tyranny, hence the whispered story of the senators who tore their king apart. This was a myth with multiple audiences, meant to inspire pride in the citizen, awe in the subject, and a check on the ambition of the ruler. It was the cornerstone of Roman identity, a civic scripture that taught every generation who they were and where they came from, in all its glorious and grim contradiction. This is the ultimate power of a founding myth. It does not merely record events, it forges a people. It takes the chaotic, often bloody accidents of history and weaves them into a purposeful narrative of destiny. It provides a shared story strong enough to hold a society together through centuries of change, war, and expansion. The legend of Romulus and Remus gave Rome its soul, a soul that was courageous, pious, pragmatic, and capable of breathtaking violence all at once. It is a mirror held up to the empire itself. So what do you see when you look into that mirror? Does the compelling figure of the twins saved by the wolf speak to you most strongly, a symbol of miraculous survival against all odds? Or does the darker, political interpretation resonate more, where the story is a tool of power, written in blood and sanctified by the state? Perhaps you find the archaeological reality of those simple huts the most profound truth of all. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which layer of this eternal mystery captures your imagination? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows beneath a legendary city, subscribe for more journeys to the heart of history's greatest enigmas.